Micheál Cahill, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much, Rob. I'm delighted to be on with you.
It's been a long time coming. I feel like I've pestered. I say this to everyone. It's grim, really, when I listen to myself. But I feel like I've pestered you for a while. But the stars have aligned. You're back home, back in Ireland, back with working for one of our sponsors, Santa College. So would you mind just giving us a bit of an update on what's going on? Because I'm guessing people will know you from your PhD work, from your work with youth athletes. So just give us a bit of an intro on you and how things have changed recently.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, thanks Rob for coming on. I think it was third time lucky this week that we finally, or this month even, that we finally got it. And before that, we were a few months and years trying to align it. But yeah, look, I mean, for me, honoured to be honest. I suppose I spent the formative years of my career listening to podcasts on drives, right from across multiple different ones, and then listening to this way back when, and you're into the much more into the hundreds with amount of episodes now. But and I even listened to it in Texas for the last 10 years. I used to get into my car and I had a regular commute from Dallas to Houston, and I would come out and it would say take a left, and then it would tell me take another left, and then it would say continue straight for 273 miles. So I feel like you've been keeping me company on those drives for a few years now as well.
Micheál, that could have been a risk of you falling asleep. I know I'm not doing the most of the talking, but when I do, there could be a nodding dog going on. But no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, mate. Carry on.
No, you're all good. But look, as you said, yeah, originally from Ireland, thus the name. I spent 10 years in Texas, introducing myself as it's Micheál, like U-Haul, but it's Micheál. So 99% of people don't get the name, but it's like a U-Haul moving truck, but it's actually Micheál. And yeah, for me, look, academia and sport, they've always been cornerstones of my life. I was lucky enough to have a family upbringing that allowed me to travel a lot as well. So, my kind of last few years has really been, or the whole of my life has been around academia, sport and travel. And like many people in the strength conditioning industry, I played a lot of sport growing up, played just about anything, and primarily Gaelic football would have been what I played as a player. And I've always viewed my workload as a balancing act between personal, professional and academic work. And me personally, I work much better in a juggling act than I do concentrating on one thing. I just get bored. So, but yeah, so I was educated in Ireland in Institute of Technology Tralee, and then University of Limerick for my bachelor's and my master's. Worked in elite level Gaelic football during that period of time as well, and I got a really good practical education. I suppose the first turning point for me were those three things, travel, personal, sport and academia, where they started to align, was just doing an internship like a lot of people in the industry. And for me, I remember sitting down one weekend and sending out 278 emails around the world, and I individualized them as best I could. And I got about 100 no's, about 175 no responses, and 3 people got back to me with possibility, and it was University of Seattle, the Manukau Steelers, which ironically ended up being affiliated with in New Zealand many years later, and the Baylor Bears. And my dad was actually sick at the time, so it was a tough time to go, but I chose to go. I took out a 10 grand loan, 2 grand to fly, 2 grand for a visa, and 6 grand to live, and I had some accommodation costs covered. And I stayed there for 8 months with Kaz Kazadi was one of the ones in over Baylor. And I loved it. And I suppose it really helped define my coaching style, my philosophy and my passion, really. After that then, yeah, I was back in Ireland, finished my master's, but then I moved to Dallas permanently in 2013. I took up a role as a director of sports science at Jesuit College, Dallas, with Jeremy Weeks, and oversaw about 21 sports across 750 athletes coming in each week, which was a huge learning experience. Just gave me a huge learning curve across so many different sports, such a vast array. And that's where I carried out majority of my PhD research on speed in young athletes, which probably chat about later. But like that juggling act, I got a little bit of itchy feet and undertook a PhD with Professor John Cronin at AUT. So from Ireland, living in Dallas, studying in Auckland at this point. So I was the longest commuting PhD student in the world, because technically I was full-time. So, but I was granted 10.5 months off campus for data collection purposes. So I used to have my meetings halfway between Dallas and Auckland, which was at Cardiff Met, with John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd were on my supervisory committee. So I was very, very lucky. I was spoiled rotten with my supervisory committee. Again, from all three things, from a personal, from a professional, and from an academic standpoint. I had John Cronin, who's a very close friend of mine at the moment and a mentor. I had John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd from a pediatric exercise physiology standpoint, and then I had Ken Clark and Matt Cross from a speed standpoint. So, you know, I consider it the dream team, and they're all very close friends of mine as well, and collaborate professionally and academically too. Yeah, so look, for that, I suppose that was one of the big second turning points in mine, was meeting John Cronin. I had a great academic experience, undergraduate and masters, but I suppose I had a taint of the research being a little bit of a academic hierarchical approach, to where I wasn't 100% sure on it, and I really wanted it to be applied. And I always viewed my research to be, a coach should be able to read it, pick it up, put it down, and say, I can implement this on a qualitative. With one athlete, I can do semi with 10 athletes, or I just understand the generic theme of this. I can still make a difference if I'm coaching 40 athletes. So, I met JC, arrived in flip-flops, sleeveless top and shorts, picked me up, brought me, JC, John Cronin, brought me for a beer, and I'll never forget it. He just said to me, take care of the student and the PhD will take care of itself. And that was just huge for me. And so I knew I had a support system around me. So I suppose if I sum it up, from starting my PhD to finishing my PhD at Auckland University of Technology, I ended up getting married, bought a house, buried a father, had 2 kids, changed job, and 6 publications in that period of time. So, you know, in fact, 6 days after my second son was born, I had to fly to Auckland to defend my thesis. So the due date and defending my thesis were very close proximity. So it was a little bit of hoping that the J would come. So we've 3 now, but so then the last 5 years I took on a CEO role at Athlete Training and Health. I was there for 5 years and oversaw the integration of the training philosophy across really a broad kind of multidisciplinary sports science and medicine team, integrating with hospitals and some professional teams across about 3 to 5 locations. And I really enjoyed it. You know, I got to work with coaches more so, and dealing with athletes from 8 to, or people from 8 to 88, from amateur to professional. I just recently left ATH. Obviously, went with Setanta. I suppose, to be honest, my passion had deviated a little bit from why I got involved in the industry, and I found myself focusing more on just some kind of real estate and business rather than really making an impact on athletes. And I wanted to bring that back to center. So moved to Dallas with 1 suitcase and came home with a wife, Jenny, 3 kids, Stephen, Jay and Tiernan, and 18 suitcases. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind 6 weeks since I arrived home, but it's been brilliant. And I suppose brings me to right now, currently just with Setanta as a vice president of strategy and registrar. And to be honest, it's just such a perfect blend of, talk about those 3 things, academia, personal and professional aspects. You know, I've always been looking at Envy with regards their approach on how they really target the practitioner and applied an academic blended learning and coaching and facilitate people's growth personally, professionally and academically at the same time. And look, I get to work very closely now with the likes of Des Ryan, Ian Jeffries, Liam Hennessy. So it's just great, and I'm swamped in what again is my passion. So it's a really good next step for me. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
What a story!
Yeah,
good story. Right, I love that, and I love the take out a 10 grand loan, $2 for the flight, $2 for the visa, six grand to live. I love that. It's a great little story. But I want to dive into speed training with youth athletes. We're going to spend a bit of time here, and then we're going to transition into specifically resisted sprint training, which I know is some of your research that we'll dive into as well. So firstly, your philosophy around speed training with youth athletes, then we're going to kind of divvy it up and go with different phases. But what's your philosophy when it comes to this?
When it comes to working with youth athletes,
Yeah.
I would say it's very holistic, and especially when you're dealing with youth athletes. One of the things I've always said is the greatest measurement of success, just overarching with youth athletes, speed aside, is the greatest, especially or younger children, that the greatest metric or measurement of success of training is, from what you can see, is cuts on their knees, bruises on their legs, and scrapes on their shins, at a young age. And then psychosocially, it's how many times they grab your hand to bring you to training or practice, not you grabbing their hand to bring them to training and practice. Because I think we've become so structured in nature, and we're starting to lose that low structured approach. And it's just, to me, it's so important. And that's key from a holistic standpoint. And then, from a training philosophy standpoint, anything I've ever done is really understanding the science and knowing why we do it. And when you know why you do it, it's always a lot easier to pick what you want to do. And you just get this vast array and this arsenal of exercises when you understand why you do it. So for me, it's what is the underlying science that aligns with who you're working with. And then really you'll be able to determine the rate of adaptation and what you want to implement. So, follow on from that, if you're talking about youth athletes and you're talking about developing speed with them, to me, there's some important things to understand that are sometimes can be overlooked. And, it's the development of speed, it runs parallel with the natural development of motor coordination. And really, it's about creating the building blocks to provide a solid foundation, which is absolutely key. I think Roger Loy used to always say that he imagined it as the first phase is laying the blocks at a young age, and the second phase then is filling them with concrete. And it always stuck with me, laying those blocks, because a failure to develop, sprint speed during childhood, that in turn can hinder opportunities as an adult. So laying those foundations is really, really key. And then it's so multifactorial, really. You can't identify one single variable. It's impossible to identify one single variable. There's so much going on with alterations to the muscle, to the tendon, motor control development and coordination as well. So, but some important things to realize is that it's non-linear in fashion. So that first spurt is in the pre-puberty, and it's typically attributed to a rapid increase in the central nervous system. And then the second spurt is that it is usually due or at the onset of sexual maturity. Little bit unclear from a gender standpoint in females with regards the how much of a spurt there is in females compared to males in that second one. But some things we see in it, across it, you can break them further down then when you understand it's non-linear, just into the pre, mid and post peak height velocity stages. So for me, that's the first thing, is just understanding some of those aspects. And, it goes back to, I think it was Avery Fagenbaum, that youth athletes are not mini adults approach to it, and just being able to ensure that you have a good psychosocial and physical way of approaching it. So
is there any periods of time, Micheál, where you can really push, and then there's other periods where you have to really pull back when it comes to the things that we're trying to do to develop speed, or as a whole, to be honest?
Yeah, I mean, even when I was at Athlete Training Health, and we were we were a commercial entity, I still turn away anyone that's younger than 8 years of age. Just didn't train them. Because I honestly believe they belong in the playground. Cuts in the knees, scrapes in the shins, bruises. And we're a commercial entity. So, but really stand by that. And I suppose that it's kind of a segue into pre, mid and post. And there's different implications at each area. Now, let me just preface it as well by saying pre, mid and post that's one band. but, training history and training competence can override those as well. We have a tendency of compartmentalizing, especially in strength conditioning, and hearing one thing and putting it in a box and the other box remains closed. There are, even there's training history and there's training competency, it's a guideline for it. But for pre-peak height velocity, for me, low structure and a focus on functional movement skills is absolutely key. And someone would say you want to get a pre-pubertal child fast. You got to sprint fast to get fast. That's the most important thing. Get up to top speed. Don't worry about dampening their central nervous system. You can bloody sprint them all day pre-puberty and you won't dampen that. But, and that's due to that kind of rapid learning effect. But I would have had people on climbing walls. I used to put youth athletes, young people, on climbing walls and just watch the way they move. Someone will move laterally, very much so in sagittal plane. Someone else will cross their legs each time. And it's just small things, developing stability, shoulder, really building the building blocks. One of the other ways of improving speed, which with youth athletes would have been a obstacle course, functional movement obstacle course we would use as well, just getting them used to all proprioceptive components. And then prepubertal would be huge exposure to multiple different forms of stimuli, resisted sprinting, overspeed sprinting, not doing it from a standpoint of trying to periodize it at a specific percentage of velocity at that age, just exposing them to a vast array. And I suppose the underlying, which I spoke about when you asked about my philosophy, is that's what we do, but why we chose it specific to that age would be, your gait is typically formed by the time you're 8 years of age. Central nervous system is 95% developed, and that's due to that rapid learning effect. And then it's just so key to give that random exposure to different sprint stimulus during that period of time. The next one is mid, where I suppose you have to be a little bit more conscientious during that period of time. It's actually mistaken a lot of time for the most rapid period of growth in a child. It's actually not. The most rapid period of growth in a child is from 0 to 2, and you get a spurt, and that's that non-linear, and you get that peak height velocity during that mid-peak height velocity phase. Some great work, obviously, with John Oliver, Rodri Lloyd, Sean Cummings. Some people have done huge work in that, but it's really due to the pruning of the brain, and it's a really good chance to reinforce functional movement skills during that period of time as well. So don't just close the book on that. You can really reinforce functional movement skills. But if you think about what happens between 0 and 2 and what happens in the growth spurt, they're both really fast periods of growth. Is they sleep all the time because the body is continually growing. So when I'm speaking with parents, it would be very much telling them that even when your child during this period of time is resting, and you can use multiple equations for this, you can do predicted adult height, you can do the Merwald equation as well for it as well, but is that even when your child is recovering, they're not really recovering like they used to or like you do, because their body is still growing at a disproportionate rate. And from a sprint standpoint, I mean, if you think of it, the long bones of the limbs are growing disproportionate to the torso. And in turn, with that, what you're getting is muscle and tendon growth differs compared to bone density. And then the likelihood of injury is much higher as well. So it's probably just listen to the athlete and listen to them. One area that's not discussed a whole pile, but that I'm fascinated from a sprinting or plyometric standpoint, is also approximately about 12 to 18 months after that growth spurt or peak height velocity, you can get a thing called peak weight velocity, which can be so much more pronounced, and obviously with the differences in testosterone in males and estrogen in females. But that can be like, when they put on that much mass, that's like, Rob, me just giving you a weight vest and telling you, right, do plyometrics on it now as well. So one of the areas I'm really interested in is the transition from that pre to mid, or preparing them for the demands of the growth spurt, but also that peak weight velocity. So like just teaching people how to do pogo hops properly, with regards, I always say, tapping to the beat of a song, so that they're striking with that midfoot and ball of the feet, so that they can actually prepare the body and have the tendons prepared to attenuate the forces that are going to be put on them when they get to that phase of time. I suppose with both of those phases, you've got speed is naturally increasing. I think it's about a circa 3% natural gains in speed. So I think I was chatting with you before, Rob. I think I said this, but it's something I was stuck in. My dad used to always say that a pat in the back is only 6 inches away from a kick up the arse.
Yes, so, you did.
So I've always tell coaches that when they're speed testing young athletes, is just account for natural gains in speed. And be careful how much you pat yourself on the back. So, because then what we see in post-peak height velocity is we see those natural speed, diminish to less than 1% to about 1.5%. Rob Myers has done, Rumpf, they've all done some great work in that, looking at it across. But we start to see it a lot tougher. And that's probably when I would get a little bit more phase specific and differentiate between some acceleration practices and some max velocity practices during that period of time, and just ensure that the older they get, that there's a little bit more synergy between the training plan and the sprint work that you're trying to improve. So that really would be key to me. But yeah, they're the 3 phases, Rob, and some of the key areas I think worth knowing from a science standpoint.
That's great. But you did tell me that quote before, and I love it. I love it just as much the second time as in the first time. So no, thank you for sharing that.
I'm full of one-liners. I'm here all day.
Keep them coming. Keep them coming. So one thing that I think is really, really interesting, based on some of the research that you've done, is sled pulls and sled pushes. 2 methods. Is there any particular reason why you would use one over the other in this sort of population? Any time periods? Any deficiencies that you may see which leads you down one track than the other? And what are the differences in terms of adaptation?
I suppose, look, if I could just rewind it back just a little bit on the sled, and then I'll come back to it, but it's like, I'm always very conscious of talking about resisted sled training, right?
We will come back to this in more detail as a whole as well.
And I'll probably emphasize this one line again, right? Because I think it's so important. I think we've become so polarized on training methods and different aspects. I did a presentation once, and it was about uniting penguins and polar bears. And you'll never see a penguin and a polar bear together because they live in different north and south poles. Right, and sometimes I think it gets that with top speed versus resisted sprinting, or vertical versus horizontal force, right? And I love them both just as equal. I saw Peter on one of your recent ones, Peter Wayand. That was excellent. I was so lucky that Peter Wayand was down the road from me in Dallas. So even though I would be, to people that don't know me well, I would sometimes joke and tell people, like, I don't have a pram or a buggy or a stroller. I actually take my kids for a walk in a Prowler push sled. Because we can become so polarized on it. So, and we'll come back to some resisted work, but yeah, specifically for youth, again, why are you trying to use it? So if I'm trying to reinforce certain aspects of technical competency, and I'll break it down, I have used a push sled because, especially with weaker athletes, primarily kids, the difference, one of the major differences obviously between using a push sled and a pull sled is the push sled is anterior load and a pull sled is posterior load. So for young athletes, it can actually help support their body and the arms out in front in order to get that good power angle or line from the heel to the ear. So for me, just to emphasize trying to get them to explode out or trying to get them to a forward lean, I see a push sled from a technical standpoint as nothing more than a progression from a wall drill. A wall drill is you get them in the angle, and I've always looked at as a basis for developing speed in youth athletes. I've looked at it starting with, right, you start with postural control, and you want to start with postural control from a static standpoint. Okay, great. You can do that through wall drills. You can work on getting proper mechanics, leg lift, get the ankle in relation to where you want it in the knee, get them to drive, push the ground away, all the good coaching cues. Great filler to have in. Static postural control. Then I'll go, okay, next progression on once they get that is dynamic postural control. And what I've done then is I've put them on a push sled. So I want you to do the same thing, except you're going to do it moving in horizontally in a dynamic movement and apply the exact same principles. So great for enforcing some accelerative technique work. And then once we get from the dynamic aspect, the next progression I would always have used was a cyclic postural control. And that's where you then start getting them to move a little bit quicker and start bringing in the more cyclic type action, or the more piston type action, specifically for accelerative strength. So there's just an example of a push sled. We'll probably talk a little bit more and resisted. One thing which I would have learned is, don't ever use a push sled unless you put a ton of weight on it from a technique standpoint, because what happens is it gets pushed too far out in front. If they can't support their body on it, the back rounds. I treat a sled as not really a sprint exercise. Like, I'm not a sprint coach. I've worked in team sports primarily, but I have a huge emphasis in acceleration in team sports. But what I would focus on for the push sled is ensuring that if there's not enough weight, your athletes will push it forward and the back will round. So I've actually stopped using it from a light to really a moderate standpoint. First off, I want to ensure that they can keep that power line from the ankle to the ear when they drive, just to ensure that we're optimizing the foot strike. Because if we're not optimizing the foot strike, we're not putting force horizontally into the ground in it. You know, it's probably just going to get an energy leak. So same as a squat. To me, it's just a horizontal strength training exercise. With I love some overspeed stuff with youth athletes as well. Get them familiar to it. Myself and Ken Clark did a really cool study up with Chris Corfist in Chicago one time, looking at overspeed and potentiation in youth athletes. And although we didn't put it in the study, you know, we had a huge PAP effect. It was outside the actual study we were looking at, but a huge PAP effect from overspeed. Just exposing them to that stimuli and exposing the body to that stimuli. So, and then sled pull, you know, same thing, just ensuring that, I think sometimes we forget to differentiate between instructing and coaching. So for me, instructing and prescribing is 20% of the battle. 80% of the battle is coaching it. So if I'm going to prescribe a sled load with a youth athlete, I might be doing it from a technical standpoint, and what I'll be asking them to do is point their belt buckle to the sky. You know, if I'm working on the transition aspect, coming out of acceleration into in the latter phases of acceleration. And sometimes the belt can help cue the athlete, the weight belt can help cue the athlete, the youth athlete, to be able to push their hips into extension as they're in that late acceleration. And we're forgetting about the load here. So I spoke about different types of postural control, but a simple guide I typically follow with youth athletes is, first, if you've got a section of 10 minutes, first let them express speed. The whole part whole approach. Let them express speed. Stand back and look and see what you're trying to coach. Stand in your observation zone, be it first 5 yards if it's acceleration emphasis, 20 to 30 yards if it's velocity emphasis, and just stand in your observation zone. Get them to express speed, look at it. Then I'll go, right, we're going to teach speed. So express speed, make sure, because if to get fast, you got to run fast. That's key. Then get them to break it down, teach speed. Okay, we're going to work on this aspect from a technical standpoint, and then I call it compete speed. Then get them to compete and see that they retain what you've taught them, or get them to compete externally or intrinsically against time or against another athlete. So, little bit of a tangent there on that, Rob, but that's just some ways, examples of resisted work, or how sled push and pull can differ with youth athletes. And
This next question may be a bit of a murky one and just too general in nature, but I think we've talked about time to develop the technical aspect of speed and time to develop the physical aspect of speed. When it comes to the kind of transition through that, like you mentioned, the 8-year-old as a minimum, or 9-year-old as a minimum, up to 16, 17, would there be variations in the amount of time you would spend on both of them, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on the time you have with them and what you're looking to get, or kind of your bang for your buck as such. I think there's always 3 areas. I was very lucky through Ken Clark. I haven't been able to. He's a good friend of mine, and call him, and obviously with Peter Wayand who as well. And these are 3 things that always stuck with me when you're thinking about speed. Is first, that speed can only change when you're in contact with the ground. So the practical application of that is focus on piston leg action. Focus on putting force into the ground, horizontal and vertical. That's it, can only change. So you want to reduce the circular type action to minimize additional time in the air. Second thing would be that increases in either horizontal force or vertical force, they have a big impact on sprint performance. So for me, and if it was sleds, it would be powerful pushes to produce greater horizontal force. And then this is really key, is that you can't have one without the other. So, you know, you need a forward body lean to direct force optimally. But if you just focus on horizontal force, all you end up with is a broken nose. That's all you end up with, because you need enough vertical force to keep you upright. So then when you take those three principles and you apply it to what you asked about time spent, you just look at the environment and the resources you're working with. For example, if I'm working with a team sport athlete with a minimal amount of time to come back, I may just try and combine them and do some resisted type work in, let's say, earlier in the week, and I'll have him do some accelerative work through, be it sled push or sled pull. Try and focus as well on really emphasizing good technique. And it doesn't mean I don't do anything unresisted. Maybe in the back half of the week, closer to games, with that team sport youth athlete, what we'll end up focusing on is some velocity work with no resisted work whatsoever. You know, obviously the sport you're working with, if you're working with track and field type athletes, you'll spend a lot more time on that, on the technical components. But here's how I view, and I'm always trying to find the good middle ground, is when I'm looking at as a resisted modality, I actually, first and foremost, I see it as horizontal strength training. It's a horizontal strength training exercise. And where I've typically put it is, in between we'll go warm up, athletic movement skills, being our jumping and sprinting ability, where we'll do technical work, and dependent on the needs of the athlete, the sport, the time available, it's all unresisted technical work, and it's getting max velocity through an acceleration phase or through max velocity. We'll do jumping before, and then after that, instead of going straight into the weight room or straight strength, I actually have a horizontal strength training component, because to me, resistance training and horizontal strength training should supplement a good training program. It shouldn't substitute for other aspects of training. So, that's typically where I would put that in a training program in there.
Perfect. Well, the second half of this chat, I want to chat specifically around resisted sprints. I know we've kind of transitioned there already, but this is more probably for not only for the youth athlete, but the adult senior athlete as well. So a practitioner out there has read your work, has read the work of various different other researchers when it comes to resisted sprints. They think they've read it, great idea, I'm in. How do they assess what's needed for their athlete? That's the first port of call. Would you be able to talk us through how you would do that? How would you assess where to focus the time within the resisted sprint method?
Yeah, I suppose like anything, resisted sprinting and different modes. It's like it's similar to, we always assessed for 1 rep max, and we would spend hours on Excel spreadsheets differentiating between 87.5% being a 5 rep max and 90% being a 3 rep max, and programming in 0.5% increments. And it was when I went to Baylor actually first, I would see the amount of time that was spent on strength in the weight room. But then I would see the amount of emphasis put on speed. And at that time, when I was there, I think it was Robert RG3 was there, and he went second in the draft for mega money. And the amount of money that a 40-yard dash can be worth, 0.1 of a second in a 40-yard dash. So speed was always king, but we weren't ever programming for speed. We've started to see that now with maximal aerobic speed. I'm actually at the moment, I just took on, because like I said, I like taking on stuff, head of athletic performance for the Clare Gaelic football team here in Ireland, and love it. I'm working with a group of 40 athletes. And really trying to get into the maximal aerobic speed, because I had an emphasis, I suppose, on strength and power for the last 10 years, where conditioning wouldn't have as much an emphasis across the majority of sports in America as it does in Europe. But so maximum aerobic speed, we started programming for that. So I'll never forget seeing a picture, and it was someone coming out of sprint blocks, and the coach beside me said, he pointed to the knee and he goes, "That's why we squat for the knee." And then he pointed to his hips, like projecting out of the blocks, and he said, "That's why we clean, hip dominant, triple extension." And I looked at it, and it made no sense to me, none whatsoever, because in my head I was saying, well, they're both vertical movements, and this is a horizontal type movement. So I would thought it made a lot, and we would spend so much time programming and assessing and monitoring those exercises in a vertical plane of motion, but not much in a horizontal plane of motion. So to me, that was the first thing I wanted to do, is look at how do we assess. So, most simply to assess is you take if you want to prescribe, let's say, a 1 rep max for resisted sled pushing or pulling, is you first off just need their max speed in, let's say, meters per second. So have them run an unresisted sprint. A lot of teams now have obviously got GPS, and there's been lots of work done on that, and it's become shown as valid for maximal sprint speed, and looking at some of the work Garrett Sanford's doing with sprint speed versus maximum aerobic speed for anaerobic speed reserve. So you can get their max speed out of that in a game, or you can just set up 2 timing gates, do a fly. You don't need to do a 40-meter fly or a 60-meter fly. Reading the research, people accelerate. Typically your team sport athletes will accelerate between 30 to 35 meters. They'll hit their top speed, or 25 to 35 meters. Majority will hit their top speed. 2 gates, and you get their top speed. Once you have that, because force and velocity have a linear relationship, what you need to do is put a load, be it sled pushing or sled pulling, a load that slows them by more than 50%, and a load that slows them by less than 50%. So what I would do typically then is 3 sprint trials, and I would have them go at pull a light load. Let's say it massively differs, obviously, dependent on surface. So you need to be consistent in surface. But that was one of the reasons, sorry, little tangent again, that was one of the reasons I got into it. Was I was chatting with, professional rugby club. I said, well, what load do you use on sled pushing or pulling? Can assist in developing speed. I'm not saying it beats top unresisted speed, right? But I'd be putting my money on it ahead of a squat, and the amount of time spent on a squat. And it was just, well, if it's wet, we put 100 kg, and if it's light, we put 60 kg on it. And I was thinking, it doesn't make sense to me. So, yeah, a light load, so it could be 30% of body mass. Then a heavy load could be 100% of body mass for a sled pull. And then I actually have a calculator on my website, which allows you to plug them in, and it'll spit out. To me, I defined it into 4 different zones. A technical kind of competency zone, which is you can use a really light load if you want to emphasize some sort of a technical one, because it doesn't affect sprint mechanics, typically under 10%. Then a speed strength zone, then a power zone, and last one a strength speed zone. So really building on some work by the likes of Brian Mann in a linear plane of motion. But 1 unresisted sprint trial, 2 resisted sprint trials. You can plug them into a calculator. I have it on my website. You can probably link that. It's mcahillphd.com, and it'll spit it out for you. Very aware that some people don't have even that GPS, or even timing gates mightn't be available to them. So you can just take the general guideline, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit, but that's when to use heavy, when to use moderate, and when to use light. I suppose from my research on a qualitative standpoint, one of the things that I would have, I suppose, came across or noticed is that let's say the load we used in a youth population, if we just prescribed by body mass, like go at 50% body mass, or 50%, both of us, Rob, went at 50% body mass as youth athletes, the actual decrease in velocity could be double that between us, given the diverging rates of strength, specifically horizontal strength. So again, just look at this from a squat standpoint. Would you ever walk into a team and say, yeah, I want everyone to put 50% of body weight on it? Because you have some guys that are really strong and some guys that are not so strong on it. So, you know, what's key is we want the load that we prescribe. It doesn't have to be to the exact percentage, but we want to get a consistent training stimulus, so that the training stimulus matches the desired adaptation, be it in a strength, speed, power, or speed strength zone for these horizontal strength training modalities.
Before we dive into why you would use low, medium, and high loads in both these pull and push, I'm going to caveat that with a question. Do people need to worry about the long-term adaptation of sprint technique using heavy loads? What do we know in this area?
It's completely, there's no research to support it, but I mean, if I take my kids for a walk in a push sled instead of a pram or a stroller or a buggy, like, that's not good. You know, it's the polarization approach to it. But, you know, if you're looking at using resisted sled training as a supplemental modality, not a substitute for a sprint training program, you know, if I do between 2 sets of between 6 to 8 reps, I take energy systems into account. So I want to solely focus on ATP, CP standpoint of it. So, you know, let's say we're doing 5 seconds. So 5 seconds by 8 is 40 seconds. By 2 sets is 1 minute 20. So in 1 minute 20, 1 minute and 20 seconds of training a week, I don't think that that's going to affect, as long as we're putting a technical emphasis on the unresisted component. Now, if we substitute and say we're not doing any unresisted sprinting, we're just going to do resisted sprinting, could it have an impact? You know, maybe. But as long as there's a holistic approach to it and we don't become polarized in our approach, I don't see any negative aspects to it. As long as, here's the other key thing, you coach it. As long as you coach it. So I've had more success, I won't say in teaching someone how to sprint properly, I'll say a team sport youth athlete where I'm caught for time. I've had a little bit more success when I'm caught for time in trying to coach proper technique of resisted, let's say, sled push or pull, getting that power line with them and getting them to maintain that straight line from ankle to hip, or getting them to push more horizontally into the ground if I'm just trying to emphasize acceleration, just the accelerative component, and I'm focusing on initial acceleration for a youth team sport athlete, than I would by taking them completely unresisted. Because what I see it as is it's an external stimulus that you can use as a coaching cue. So it's a different type of coaching, and it doesn't mean you don't do it unresisted and you don't focus on it. Now, track and field, I learned a very big lesson. I was training, she was the number 2 in state in Dallas, training her. I was doing my PhD, and I did a lot of work on some resisted sled push work, and I actually increased some levels of acceleration, but I did it at the cost of decreasing Vmax with her. And I just put too much on the initial acceleration and then not enough on Vmax. And what she needed was, she actually needed much more max velocity stuff. But the demands of an individual track and field athlete compared to a team sport athlete are very, very different, you know, with regards. And again, let's not get polarized. Multiple reasons to do unresisted sprint training in addition to resisted. Injury prevention. I do it with current team I'm head of Pacey Performance. We'll do it closer to game so that we actually, within 48 hours, so we'll do max velocity work, so we actually prepare them for the demands of what they're going to face on the weekend. On the Saturday or Sunday, we might do it on the Thursday. We do more velocity work. Plyometrics. Ken used to always say this to me, Ken Clark, is sprinting is the greatest plyometric the body can do. There is no exercise that gets you on and off the ground in 0.1 of a second, like sprinting. So unresisted sprinting from a plyometric standpoint. So again, it's about not being polarized, but sometimes with team sport athletes, I think you can get good bang for your buck as long as you coach it and you can incorporate different aspects of technical reinforcement of exercises while getting a horizontal strength training stimulus, which could all have been preceded by doing some unresisted sprint work with an emphasis on max velocity and proper technique without any external load. Did that...
One thing I just want to cover quick...
explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Okay, yeah.
One thing I want to just come back to quickly, and it's something that I spoke to JB Marin about, and that's the surface friction. You mentioned it with the wet and the dry. Is there anything that people can do to get a little bit more of an objective view on the surface that they're using to then manipulate accordingly?
Yeah, so, one of the things I would have done with that, there was something I really liked. I was spoilt for weather in Texas the last 10 years, obviously. Different ball game being home in Ireland. But we would have to go indoors because of the heat. I don't have to go indoors ever because of the heat in Ireland anymore, but we might go indoors sometimes. And I used this magic carpet sled indoors, and it would be just slide across it. So one of the things I would do is I would just base it off kind of a time under tension or the energy system I'm trying to, improve, maybe ATP. So what I would do is just cut my reps off. So I would want to know the strength training zone that I'm trying to train in, be it strength speed with an emphasis on maybe some initial acceleration, be it power with some of the mid to late acceleration side of it, or I can even use the different zones as a tapering strategy, so that just within my periodized plan, my horizontal strength training modalities are going to decrease in the overall volume but increase in sprint intensity, or decrease in the load intensity on it and taper into competition. But one of the things I would have done is I would have just had them sprint for 4 to 5 seconds, so that I just knew that the distance then they were covering was going to give enough of the stimulus. And for example, if I wanted to focus on that initial acceleration, I would typically try and have the sprint distance be under 10 yards. So what I'm trying to do then is manipulate the load to where I'm telling athletes, you need to cross the 10-yard line before I blow the whistle on the 4-second mark. And they would up their load till they get to that point. And that's one where you don't need assessment. You can do it when you're working with large groups or large athletes. If I have them in the power zone, I used to like them sprinting a little bit more, like 17 to 20 type yards. And then we would up the load until they can cover that kind of 17 yards in the 4 seconds, 4 to 5 seconds on it. And then, or what I would do is, if we're going on a speed strength, used to like it around 22.5 to 25 yards, I would have them increase the load until they can cross it on the whistle in that 4 seconds as well. So that's how I would have worked it with large groups of athletes, and exactly how I'm going to have to work it with the group of athletes I have at the moment as well. And that'll account for friction. Be it you're on a AstroTurf, be it you're on concrete, be it you're on grass. Is it ideal? Is it optimal? No, but we can't always do the best. We can do the best available, which is key.
One thing I want to finish off with, and this is something that you mentioned beforehand, and we're going back and forth with the type of questions we're going to go through today. Common misconceptions, questions, or gripes that people have with resisted sprinting. It was one thing that was brought up because maybe you've had a little few Twitter spats here and there. Maybe you hinted at
the odd
one with a, dare I say, popular. Certainly a polarizing character in our industry. Won't mention the name, that's fine. People can make up their own mind. But is there anything that was common in those conversations that have come up elsewhere that you could kind of lay your opinions on?
Yeah, I think it's really just that it's the polarized approach. You know, people say changing your lens, right? We'll change our lens. And what we do, I really believe that the distortion lies in the brain behind the lens, you know, on to what your kind of bias would be. You know, me, I've worked with, like I said, got great exposure at Jesuit College Dallas with 21 sports across 750 athletes, and would totally change my approach on how I prescribe training for different people. But the key thing to really realize, and the big take-home message, is that resisted sled training is a tool in your toolbox. And what it should do is it should supplement a well-rounded training program for a specific purpose within a periodized plan specific to the athlete. And it should not substitute for unresisted sprinting or traditional strength training. So when I was working with track and field coaches and athletes, and I was specifically in Jesuit with Doug Robinson, and a little bit hesitant to resisted sprinting at the start, and I said, view it like this. I'm going to take out our deadlift with the athletes, and I'm going to plug in some heavy resisted sprinting rather than, and don't view it as a track and field technical exercise, view it as a horizontal strength training modality rather than us focusing on the deadlift. The combination, which is interesting, what I noticed is you do have to be a little careful. There's not much research on it, but just anecdotally, is you have to be a little careful, specifically with some developmental athletes and team sport athletes specifically that have a lot of accelerations and decelerations. I specifically saw it in lacrosse, was the combination of certain compound, your traditional compound A-block vertical strength training movements with heavy resisted sled training would have been, I would have seen when I combined some heavy load work with some heavy squats, I actually saw a lot of adductor strains with it as well, and I changed out for some glute bridge or some hip thrust exercises then as well, just so the loading was a little less on the knee and the adductor. So some aspects like that. But that's the key thing, is that it supplements a well-rounded training program, and it does not substitute for a unresisted sprinting or traditional strength training program. See if it fits, and if it doesn't fit in your program, it's fine. I don't think anyone is going to get too upset about it. View it like you would view how you treat a squat. The other thing, I suppose, kind of take home message would be that with percentage body mass versus what I had used, which was the velocity decrement approach, is it's just conscious to be aware then as well that there's large between athlete variations exist. So the sled push typically exhibits a much higher variability than a sled pull, probably because the movement is initiated with the arms. But both of those exercises the exercises exhibit an increased variability with increasing sled loads. So the higher the load you put on, the more variability you have between athletes, reinforcing the need for the velocity decrement just to individualize the type of training that you're looking for. And then the last thing is kind of take home, I suppose, have on it would be that the heavier external loads, they might favor horizontal force production in the early phase of acceleration, specifically that 0 to 10. But what I had found is that sled pulling had a little bit more pronounced results compared to sled pushing. But I actually like heavy sled pushing now to re-emphasize. I mean, we hear multiple times from a technical standpoint, we need to slow down sometimes to speed up in teaching some technical aspects. Well, I would use the sled as a dynamic wall drill to slow them down, but emphasize some different aspects of postural control or leg mechanics on it. So, but look, as I said, the main thing is don't be polarized on it. It's a tool in the toolbox with regards to approach to it, and that it should supplement a well-rounded program. That's just key and simple.
Great place to finish off. Thank you for that. We didn't mention the person's name, which you got away with there, so I'm happy with that as well. Otherwise, there might be some hate coming on your Twitter direct messages in a couple of weeks.
I've had some really good discussion. Yeah, I've had some really good discussions with multiple people, on it. And usually, perspective and empathy will solve majority of the world's problems. And if you get a chance to just share your perspective with people, and people are open to it, and look, I love confrontation anyway, so I don't, not on social media as much. I enjoy it much more face to face. So,
no, that's great, mate. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the last hour, and thank you very much for fitting me in the first 6 weeks to you coming back to Ireland, because I know it's been a very chaotic, especially with 3 kids in tow as well. But where can people get to know more about you, social media, research, etc.?
Yeah, so I suppose my Twitter handle probably, which is mcahill PhD, and then I have a website, mcahillphd.com, on that as well. Obviously through Setanta College is probably a good opportunity as well, where you can reach me through that too. And yeah, they're kind of, I suppose, the three platforms, Rob, where I can be reached at.
Perfect. Well, like I say, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you on, to have a chat, and look forward to keeping in touch, and good luck with the new role, been back home and everything else.
No, thanks very much. Really appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.